My wealthy mother-in-law, Karen, has treated me like a servant for many years. I finally stopped putting up with it and devised a perfect plan for revenge on her. Alex's words sliced through the noise of dishes like a sharp knife. "Alara, bring me some tea now." I paused, my hands still in the soapy water. "Hold on, I'm washing the dishes," I replied. His tone was both shocked and impatient. "Stop that, and bring me the tea immediately. Can't you follow simple orders?" Before I could speak, he interrupted. "You're such a useless wife. Make me some sweet coffee," another voice ordered. It was my mother-in-law, Mrs. Whitmore, from the living room. She sat there, munching a piece of cake she grabbed from the fridge, her eyes gleaming with malice. I sighed and glanced at the pile of dishes. "There are so many," I muttered. "Leave them for later. Just do what we tell you, useless wife," Alex hissed, his words stinging. I was Era, a 28-year-old working mother, whose life often felt more like a prison than a home. Married at 23, I had hoped for love and companionship, but instead, I found myself under the control of Alex and his domineering mother. Our 4-year-old son was the only bright spot in my otherwise bleak existence. We lived in Alex's parents' house, a decision forced upon me under the guise of caring for Mrs. Whitmore after my father-in-law's passing. Initially, I sympathized with her supposed grief, but it soon became clear that I was nothing more than a pawn in her cruel game of home oppression. Cooking, cleaning, and working were never enough. My efforts were met with disdain, and my meals were either left uneaten or sharply criticized. "This stir-fry is so poorly done," Mrs. Whitmore would comment. "Cook it properly from scratch," she'd demand. "I'm busy and can only make simple dishes," I would explain, trying to remain calm. "That's why I hate backtalk from my daughter-in-law," she would retort. "Why don't you cook from scratch yourself, if you're such a good cook?" I dared to reply once, only to regret it immediately. "Why would I do the cleaning with you here?" She responded coldly, dismissively. "Are you out of your mind?" Their cruelty grew over time, shifting from harsh words to a suffocating silence. They began to ignore me entirely, as if I were invisible in my own home. For 5 years, I endured this oppressive atmosphere. Alex and I turned 35 and 33, respectively, and our son grew up, but the toxic air in the house remained. My mother-in-law, now 63, seemed to thrive on my suffering. One evening, as I trudged home from work, a heavy realization hit me. They saw me as insignificant. I was a mere shadow, unnoticed and unheard. The only voice that acknowledged me was my son's. The thought of losing even that small recognition was unbearable. When I got home, I started cooking immediately, hoping it would lift my spirits. I prepared mapo tofu, fried chicken, and a stir-fry with bell peppers and pork to bring some normalcy to our dinner. "Bring me the mayo," Alex said suddenly, breaking his long silence. "Sure, here it is," I replied, handing him the mayo. His first words to me in ages were not a thank you or a conversation, but a command. It was the last straw. Mrs. Whitmore then ordered me to clean the toilet. "What now?" I asked, shocked. "Yes, now," she demanded, her voice dripping with contempt. Unable to hold back my frustration, I snapped, "Don't say such things while we're eating. It's disgusting, just like your heart." She immediately fired back, and Alex demanded that I apologize to his mother. But for the first time in years, I stood my ground and refused. That moment marked a turning point. I realized I had to leave this toxic environment, not just for myself, but for my son's well-being. I returned to my room, my resolve hardening. I downloaded divorce papers, filled them out, and placed them in front of Alex. His shock was evident, but I remained firm. "I'm filing these," I declared. Looking at my husband's confused expression, I realized I had finally stepped out of the shadows. It was time to reclaim my life. The days following my declaration were filled with cold glares and hurtful remarks. But amidst the chaos, I found an unexpected sense of freedom. One evening, as I served dinner, Mrs. Whitmore glanced at the food with disgust. You call this food? Even a child can cook better. I bit my tongue and focused on my son's happy face. Eat up, sweetheart. I made your favorite tonight. Alex's voice dripped with sarcasm. Oh, playing the perfect mother now, are we? What a joke. I could feel my anger rising, but kept my composure. I'm just trying to make a nice meal for our son, I replied calmly. Mrs. Whitmore snorted. Don't act so high and mighty. You're just a burden here. The tension at the table was palpable. Alex's insults grew more intense. So, Alara, have you thought about how you'll survive after the divorce? You can barely manage a house, let alone your own life. I looked him straight in the eyes. I've been supporting this family for years. I'm not worried about taking care of myself or our son. His smug expression faltered slightly, and a flicker of concern appeared. Mrs. Whitmore quickly intervened. Don't be ridiculous. You need us more than we need you. The conversation shifted to finances, a topic they usually avoided. You do realize that without my salary, this house would fall apart, I said. I spoke to myself rather than to them. Mrs. Whitmore sneered. We'll manage. We don't need your charity. But Alex's silence spoke volumes. He knew the truth. They would face serious financial trouble if I didn't continue providing for them. Their behavior worsened in the following days. Mrs. Whitmore alternated between attempting to sweet-talk me into staying and shouting insults when I refused. Alex, on the other hand, seemed bewildered, his arrogance crumbling as the reality of their financial dependence became undeniable. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between them that sent a chill through me. She can't just leave us like this, Alex growled. We need her money. Mrs. Whitmore's response was cold and calculating. Don't worry, I have a plan. We'll make her life so miserable that she won't want to leave. Hearing their true intentions laid bare was a revelation. They didn't care about me or our son. It was all about control and money. That night, as I lay in bed, an idea began to form in my mind. If they wanted a battle, I'd give them one, but it wouldn't be fought with words or petty arguments. I'd hit them where it would hurt the most, their pride and their finances. The following morning, I set my plan in motion. I contacted a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with excellent recommendations. I want a divorce, and I want to make sure they don't get a single penny more than they deserve, I told her. She nodded, her eyes full of determination. We'll make sure of that. You've been the only breadwinner, right? We'll use that to our advantage. My resolve grew stronger with each passing day. I began keeping detailed records. Insults, financial manipulation, even small grievances. It was time to turn the tables. Time to let them face the consequences of their actions. As I prepared my case, a sense of empowerment filled me for the first time in years. I felt like I was finally in control of my destiny. The weight of disdain was slowly lifting, revealing the dawn of a new chapter. As the divorce proceedings began, the atmosphere in the house turned even more toxic. Yet, with each passing day, my anxiety faded, replaced by unwavering determination. Mrs. Whitmore decided to try a different approach. One evening, Alara, dear, why don't we forget all this ugly business? You know we're family. Her words were insincere, dripping with false sweetness. I met her gaze without flinching. Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me. Alex, who had been silently observing, scoffed. Oh, playing the victim now? You're not as innocent as you pretend to be. A wave of fury surged within me, but I kept my voice steady. I'm not playing anything, Alex. I'm just no longer willing to be your scapegoat. As usual, the conversation turned to finances. You think you can just take our son and leave? How will you support him? Alex asked, skeptical. I grinned, my lips curling slightly in a confident smile. I've been supporting this family for years. I think I can manage. Mrs. Whitmore sneered, her gaze filled with disdain. You're nothing without us. You'll come crawling back. But their words no longer held any power over me. I knew my worth, and I understood the truth. The next day, I met with my lawyer again. She laid out the strategy clearly. We'll expose their financial dependency on you. It'll play a key role in the custody battle and the division of assets. I nodded, feeling vindicated. The law was on my side, and I was ready to fight back. At home, the tension reached its boiling point. Mrs. Whitmore's attempts to undermine me grew more desperate. "You think you're so clever?" she sneered one evening. "But you're just a cold-hearted woman abandoning your family." I locked eyes with her. "No, I'm a woman who's finally standing up for herself." Alex intervened, his voice full of fury. "You'll regret this. You can't survive without me." But his threats fell on deaf ears. I was done being intimidated. As the days passed, my preparations for the court battle grew more intense. I gathered financial records, documented their cruel remarks, and collected evidence of their neglect. One afternoon, as I was organizing my papers, my son approached me. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" His voice was soft and uncertain. I pulled him into a hug, feeling a rush of protectiveness. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine. We're leaving this place, and we're going to start a new, happy life. Just you and me." His arms tightened around me, and in that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for my son's future. As the court hearing approached, the possibility of freedom loomed closer. I was ready to confront Alex and Mrs. Whitmore and put an end to their tyranny and emotional abuse. I was determined to reclaim my life and provide my son with the peace and happiness he deserved. It was time for justice, and I would ensure it was served. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I was filled with a mix of dread and resolve. Sitting across from Alex and Mrs. Whitmore in court, I felt as though the world had shifted. This was the moment that would change everything. The proceedings began with a cold, formal tone. Alex's lawyer painted him as a devoted husband and father, unfairly accused. Mrs. Whitmore played the sorrowful mother-in-law, the victim of her ungrateful daughter-in-law. However, their performances were transparent, and their lies were weak. When it was my turn, I spoke calmly but firmly. "I've been the sole provider for this family for years. My husband's unemployment and his mother's manipulative behavior have been constant sources of stress." Alex interrupted, his voice tinged with faux hurt. "Alara, how could you say that? I've always supported you." I turned to him, my gaze unwavering. "Alex, support isn't about words. It's about actions. And all your actions have shown is selfishness and cruelty." The judge listened intently as I presented my evidence. Financial records, audio recordings of their verbal abuse, and testimony from neighbors who had witnessed their behavior. The truth was irrefutable. As the evidence mounted, Alex's facade began to crumble, and Mrs. Whitmore's composure slipped away. The courtroom grew silent, the air thick with tension. Then came the revelation that sealed their fate. My lawyer submitted photos and documentation proving Alex's affair and Mrs. Whitmore's secret relationship with Mr. Harwood, a wealthy neighbor. Whispers spread to the courtroom as compromising photos of them were shown. Their lie was exposed for all to see. Alex's face drained of color, his eyes wide with shock. Mrs. Whitmore's face contorted with fury, her hands trembling. "You violated our privacy," she screeched. I met her gaze, my voice steady but firm. "No, I've exposed the truth you've both been hiding for far too long." The court demanded order, but the damage had already been done. Their credibility was shattered, their lies laid bare in the harsh light of truth. As the hearing concluded, the judge's decision was clear. I was granted full custody of our son, and a fair division of assets was ordered. Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were left with only their ruined reputations. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a tremendous weight lift from my shoulders. The years of deceit and emotional torment had finally come to an end. I had faced my oppressors and emerged victorious. But the most rewarding moment came when my son rushed into my arms outside the courthouse, his face alight with relief and joy. "We did it, Mom," he exclaimed, his voice full of excitement. "Yes, we did," I said, holding him tightly. "We're free now. This is just the beginning for us." As we walked away hand in hand, I realized that this victory was about more than just me. It was a triumph for anyone who had ever been made to feel small, helpless, or unworthy. It represented a victory for truth and justice. It was the start of a new chapter, one filled with hope and the promise of a better future. The court's verdict had an immediate and chaotic impact. The tale of Alex and Mrs. Whitmore's deception spread like wildfire, destroying their reputations in our small neighborhood. They could no longer hide behind their false facade of respectability. In the days that followed the ruling, I focused on rebuilding my life with my son. But I couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing that Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were facing the consequences of their actions. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I had an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Harwood, Mr. Harwood's wife. Her eyes were red from unshed tears. "Alara, I've heard everything. I can't believe what Sylvia, Mrs. Whitmore, did," she said, her voice breaking. I invited her in and offered her a cup of tea. As we sat at the kitchen table, she shared her heartbreak. I trusted her as a neighbor and friend. "To think she was having an affair with my husband," she said, her voice trembling. I listened, offering words of comfort. Mrs. Whitmore's actions had clearly caused more damage than she ever anticipated. The next day, I saw Alex in town. He was a shadow of his former self, his arrogance replaced with a defeated expression. "Alara, please, can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I paused, facing him. "What's there to talk about, Alex?" He fidgeted, unwilling to meet my gaze. "I'm sorry for everything. I didn't realize how much I depended on you, how much I relied on your strength." His apology, though late, signaled a shift in power. He had lost everything: his dignity, his home, and his family. In that loss, he had finally acknowledged his own faults. But Mrs. Whitmore bore the heaviest criticism. Her affair with Mr. Harwood not only ruined her reputation, but also led to legal troubles. Mrs. Harwood filed for divorce and sued her for alienation of affection. I heard about Mrs. Whitmore's downfall through whispers from neighbors. She had become an outcast, rejected by people she once called friends. One day, I saw Sylvia at the grocery store, rushing through the aisles with her head down. Our paths crossed, and for a brief moment, our eyes locked. The hatred and defeat in her eyes were unmistakable. "You did this to me," she muttered under her breath as she passed. I watched her walk away, her figure shrinking as she hurried off, eyes full of resentment. I felt a mix of pity for her and satisfaction for myself. "No, Sylvia," I whispered to myself. "You did this to yourself." The tides of justice had finally turned. All the lies, manipulation, and emotional torture they had subjected me to had come full circle. The consequences of their actions were now irreversible. As I watched them struggle in the aftermath of their deceit, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. But it wasn't just about them getting what they deserved. The real reward was in the freedom I had gained. The best form of retribution, I realized, was a revenge. It was living a peaceful, strong life free from the toxicity and harm they had inflicted on me for so long. My focus shifted back to what truly mattered: the future I was building with my son. We were free now, free from the prison they had trapped me in for all those years. I had broken free, and now I was living the life I had always dreamed of. This wasn't just a story of revenge or victory. It was a story of liberation. It was a powerful testament to my strength and resilience. I had taken control of my destiny, broken free from abuse, and released myself from their manipulative grip. As I looked ahead, I knew the future was bright. The best was yet to come. I was no longer a prisoner of their cruelty. I was free, and the world was mine to conquer.